For nearly half a century, the United States government held a secret that could name the traitors in its own house. It knew, in many cases, exactly who had spied for the Soviet Union during and after the Second World War. It knew because it had secretly broken into the supposedly unbreakable code the Soviets used to talk to their agents and read their secret mail. And for almost 50 years, it could not say a word about it, could not use what it knew in a courtroom, could not tell the public, because the only thing more valuable than catching the spies was keeping secret the fact that it could read the messages at all. The program was called Venona, and it is one of the strangest stories in the history of American intelligence, because it is a story about knowing the truth and being unable to use it. Everything I am about to tell you comes from the program's own declassified record. In 1995, the National Security Agency finally released the Venona decrypts to the public. Thousands of translated Soviet messages, along with histories explaining how the break was made. You can read them yourself today. So this is not legend or rumor. It is the documents, opened at last after half a century in the dark. To understand Venona, you have to go back to the Second World War, to a moment when the United States and the Soviet Union were, on paper, allies against Nazi Germany. They were fighting the same enemy. They were sending each other supplies. And the whole time, Soviet intelligence was running a determined campaign of espionage against its American partner, recruiting agents inside the American government, inside its laboratories, inside the most secret project of the entire war. In 1943, an American code-breaking effort began collecting the encrypted cables that Soviet diplomatic and intelligence offices in the United States were sending back to Moscow. At the time, no one could read them. The messages were just piling up, thousands of them, locked tight. The Americans filed them away and kept collecting, on the chance that someday there might be a way in. The reason they seemed impossible to read comes down to the way the Soviets encrypted them, a method that is, in theory, perfect. It is called a one-time pad. The idea is simple and beautiful. You take your message and you scramble it using a page of completely random numbers, a key. As long as that key is truly random, used only once, and known to no one but the sender and the receiver, the result is unbreakable. Not hard to break. Impossible. There is no pattern to find, no math that cracks it, because the scrambling is pure randomness with no structure underneath. A correctly used one-time pad is the one encryption method that even infinite computing power cannot defeat. The Soviet system was built on this foundation, and that is why the cables sat unread. But there is one fatal word in that promise, and the word is once. The whole guarantee depends on each page of key being used a single time and then destroyed. Use a page twice, and the perfect system develops a crack, a faint structure that a patient mind can begin to pull apart. And somewhere in the pressure of the war, the Soviet operation that manufactured these key pages made a mistake. To keep up with demand, they produced duplicate pages, the same random key sent out to different users. It was a small shortcut in a factory under wartime strain. It was also the single thread that would unravel everything, because it meant that some of those untouchable messages had been encrypted with the same key, and that, to the right codebreaker, was an opening. The right codebreaker was a quiet, scholarly man named Meredith Gardner. He was a linguist of extraordinary range, a man who collected languages the way other people collect stamps, and he sat among the stacks of unread Soviet traffic, looking for the faint repetitions that the duplicated keys had left behind. It was painstaking work, the kind that rewards obsession and patience above all else. And just before Christmas of 1946, Gardner made the break that opened the door. He read a message, and what he read stopped him cold. It was a list of names, scientists, the leading physicists working on the American atomic bomb. The Soviets had been inside the Manhattan Project, the most secret undertaking of the war, the program that built the weapon that ended it. The message Gardner had decrypted was proof, in the enemy's own words, that the atomic secret had been stolen. That single thread began to pull a much larger picture into view, and as more messages yielded, what it showed grew more alarming. The Soviet effort against the bomb even had its own code name in the traffic, and the decrypts made clear it had not been a vague ambition, but a real and successful penetration. To turn these fragments into actual identifications, though, the codebreakers needed help, because the messages did not use real names. They used cover names, code words standing in for the actual people. A spy would be called Antenna, or Liberal, or some other invented label, and the work of figuring out which living human being hid behind each cover name required a different kind of detective. That detective came from the FBI, an agent named Robert Lamphere, who paired the decrypted hints with the Bureau's own files and investigations. A message might reveal that a certain agent had a particular job, lived in a particular place, had a wife with a particular name. Match those details against the real world, and a cover name slowly resolved into a face. What the matching revealed was a network. There was the physicist who had passed detailed atomic information to the Soviets from inside the bomb project, a betrayal that may have saved Moscow years of work. There was a young scientist, barely out of his teens, who had done the same. And there were the cover names Antenna and later Liberal, which the evidence tied to a New York engineer named Julius Rosenberg. One decrypted message even referred to this agent's wife by her first name, Ethel. The Rosenberg case would become one of the most divisive in American history, and we will come back to what Venona does and does not prove about it, because that nuance matters. And the reach did not stop at America's shores. As more of the traffic gave way, the codebreakers found cover names that did not belong to Americans at all, but to spies operating inside the British government, Washington's closest ally. One decrypted thread pointed to a source, cover named Homer, who had been passing secrets from inside the British embassy in Washington, with access to the most sensitive Anglo-American discussions of the early atomic age. The hunt to put a real name to Homer narrowed, over months, onto a senior British diplomat named Donald Maclean. He was one of a ring of upper-class Englishmen recruited as young idealists at Cambridge in the 1930s, who had burrowed deep into British intelligence and diplomacy and served Moscow for decades. We will tell that ring's full story another day, because it deserves one. But it was Venona, the same patient reading of the same broken code, that first pulled the thread. And in 1951, just as the net was closing, Maclean and a fellow member of the ring vanished, surfacing years later in Moscow, tipped off, it later emerged, from inside Western intelligence itself. Even the breaking of the Unbreakable Code could be outrun by a traitor with a warning. Here's the agonizing problem that sat at the center of the whole program. The government was reading proof of espionage, but it could not use that proof, because to use it in a courtroom would be to announce to the Soviet Union that its supposedly unbreakable code had been broken. The moment the Soviets learned that, they would fix the flaw, change their methods, and the window would slam shut. So the intelligence from Venona was treated as a guide, not as evidence. It could point the FBI toward a suspect, tell investigators where to look, but the case that actually went to trial had to be built on other things, on confessions and surveillance and conventional proof. When Julius and Ethel Rosenberg stood trial, the jury never heard the word Venona. The decrypts that had helped focus suspicion on them stayed locked away. The most important evidence in the case was sitting in a file the court was never allowed to see. This is the strange shape of the whole program. It created a class of guilt that the government was certain of but could not prove in the open, and a class of secrets too valuable to spend even on justice. The codebreakers in the FBI carried knowledge they could act on only indirectly, nudging cases along while never revealing the source. Some spies were simply eased out of sensitive jobs rather than arrested, because an arrest would raise questions that pointed back to the secret. The price of being able to read the enemy's mail was the discipline never to admit you were reading it, and the discipline held, remarkably, for decades. Venona stayed secret long after the messages themselves had stopped being current. The program officially ran until 1980. The decrypts stayed classified for years beyond that. The circle of people who knew was kept so tight that by some accounts, even presidents were not always fully briefed on it. A handful of codebreakers and agents carried one of the most consequential secrets of the Cold War, and kept it through the entire era of the great spy scandals, the McCarthy years, the show trials, the public hysteria about hidden communists. All through that uproar, the people who actually held the documentary proof of Soviet espionage said nothing. That silence is part of what makes the McCarthy era such a tragedy on both sides. Because here's the thing the documents finally settled when they came out. There really had been Soviet spies. The penetration was real. Some of the people accused in those years were in fact guilty, and Venona shows it in the enemy's own cables. But the public could not see that evidence, and so the debate over communist infiltration was conducted almost entirely in the dark, fueled by reckless accusation on one side and angry denial on the other, while the actual proof sat in a vault. The country argued about a question it could not answer. because the answer was classified. The decision to finally open Venona came in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, and the code it used was long dead. A government commission on secrecy, led by a thoughtful senator, made the case that the public had a right to see the evidence the government had hidden for half a century, evidence of a genuine threat that had been kept from the very citizens it concerned. And so, beginning in the summer of 1995, the National Security Agency released the decrypts in batches until nearly 3,000 translated messages were public. Historians who had argued for decades about who was a spy and who was falsely accused suddenly had a new and powerful source, written not by accusers or defenders, but by the Soviet handlers themselves. What the decrypt showed was both a confirmation and a correction. And this is the part I want to land on, because it is the heart of why this story belongs in these files. On one hand, Venona confirmed that Soviet espionage in America had been real and serious, that the atomic secrets had genuinely been stolen, that some of the most famous accused had in fact been working for Moscow. The fearful had been right that there were spies. On the other hand, Venona disciplined the fear, because the documents named some people and pointedly did not name others. The decrypts did not support the wildest claims of the era, the idea that the government was riddled top to bottom with thousands of hidden agents. The number of people actually identifiable in the traffic was, by careful scholarly counts, perhaps a few dozen. Real, damaging, but specific. The evidence both vindicated the existence of the threat and cut against its exaggeration. It replaced a screaming argument with a documented list. And a documented list is a smaller and more honest thing than a panic. I have to be careful here because Venona is not a magic decoder that settles every case, and the honest version of the story includes its limits. Some identifications are firm, supported by multiple matching details. Others are contested to this day. The most famous of the disputed ones involves a cover name in a 1945 cable, an agent the FBI tentatively identified as a senior State Department official named Alger Hiss. Some scholars find that identification convincing. Others point to genuine problems with it and argue it does not hold. I am not going to stand here and tell you the cable closes the Hiss case, because the honest answer is that serious people still disagree, and a responsible reading of the documents has to say so. That is the difference between using these files and abusing them. The decrypts are powerful evidence, but they are evidence to be weighed, not a verdict to be shouted. And that, in the end, is the real lesson of Venona, the reason it sits alongside the other files in this series. For 50 years, a government held the proof of who its enemies were inside its own walls and could not use it, because the method of knowing was more precious than the knowledge. When the proof was finally released, it did not feed the hysteria that had raged in ignorance. It did the opposite. It replaced rumor with record, replaced the most frightened voice in the room with a stack of specific, checkable documents, and let the country finally see the real shape of what had happened, neither as large as the panic had insisted, nor as innocent as the denials had claimed. The truth was narrower and harder and more interesting than either side had been able to prove. The messages are public now. The cover names and the real names, the atomic spies and the contested cases, the brilliant, patient work of a linguist reading the enemy's mail by the light of a single repeated key. It is all there, declassified, waiting. You can read the actual decrypts and the histories of how they were broken and decide for yourself what they prove and what they do not. Read them yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.